So I don't know what I was thinking back when I planned this sermon series to deal with Jacob for 4 Sundays in a row. We're only on the third one. So we have this sermon and another next week. And I just got to be honest with you, this passage is hard for the preacher. It's not a difficult text. It's not a difficult story. It's not one that's complicated to really understand. There's no difficult Greek words that might have some different kind of translation. It's not something that tells us something awful that we're surprised about God so much. It's just a story. A tricky story. And we wonder what God really thinks about what's happened here. This story, I think, raises some interesting questions, maybe some difficult questions. Maybe part of the reason for this story is for us to grapple with some of these things. Some of the interesting questions, one that I have, doesn't really do us much good, but I think it's a question that I think about and perhaps you have thought of, and that is, how in the world did Jacob not know? How did he not know what woman he was with? He had been in love with Rachel for 7 years. He had worked for 7 years to have Rachel. How did he not know? I don't have a good answer for that one. That leads to maybe another question. You know, in this text we have this interesting marriage and how it comes. And there's been a lot of talk in the past few years and beyond that about us going to the biblical view of marriage and understanding and adopting a biblical view of marriage. And when people talk about a biblical view of marriage, is this what they mean? You can marry your cousin. A father can just slip in a different daughter. You can have multiple wives. I oftentimes, when I counsel couples on marriage, we talk about honesty and how honest you have to be with each other and tell the truth. And you know, the first part of this marriage is on a complete lie. He doesn't even realize who he's married. Is this what we mean when we talk about a biblical view of marriage? And then, if we ponder that and we wonder about that, then I think the question is, what does God think? What does God think about this? What we find in this text is that God is silent. We don't know what God thinks about what's happened here. I mean, here is Jacob, the one in whom he is just told, I'm going to keep my promise with you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bring you back to this land, to the land of your father. You will be a blessing to all of the world. They will be blessed because of you. God is putting everything, it seems, on Jacob. And then this happened. Is this what God wanted? What does God think about all of this? And while we're talking about people that are silent in the story, what do the women think? We don't get to hear their opinion about this matter, Leah or Rachel. What does Leah think? The way her father marries her off is to trick someone into marrying her. What does Rachel think? How does she feel deal about having to share her husband, this guy that really, really loves her, with her older sister. We don't hear anything from the women. They are silent in this narrative. And does that mean that women are just supposed to do what they're told? That they can be forced into these marriages? Is this what the Bible says to us? I mean, if so, I think we can look at the testimony that we see in the time of Christ. We see that in Jesus' ministry and his coming, women have a pretty important role, right? I mean, Jesus came from a virgin, a young woman. Men had nothing to do with that. At the resurrection, the women were not silent. They were the ones that were told to go, proclaim, and bear witness that Jesus is alive. The first ones to be told to go. We also know that women supported Jesus in his ministry. Luke tells us that. They're the ones that paid the bills. But here, women are silent. What do they think? Could they possibly be happy with what their father has done? Could they be pleased? A lot of questions that come out. But perhaps another question is, what does this story mean? What does this tell us about God? What are the authors here trying to get at? Is this story here to tell us that what goes around comes around? If you're a trickster, you're going to end up getting tricked. Right? That's what happens here. Jacob has lived his life tricking his brother, cheating his way out. That's his name, his heel to cheat. And now he meets his match with his uncle. And he is the one that is tricked. Tricked into marrying the wrong woman. Tricked into taking both of Laban's daughters. But is that the message? What comes around goes around? Or is there something else? I want to take a step back from this story. I want us to go back a little bit to last week's scripture. Last week we talked about the vision that Jacob saw. If you remember, Jacob was running away from his family. His life had been threatened by his brother because he had tricked his brother, taken the blessing from his dad, from his brother, and he couldn't be there anymore. His mother sent him away. And so Jacob has left. His family is a mess, and he has a vision from God. A pretty incredible vision, right? He sees angels ascending and descending, and God speaks to Jacob, and God says to him, he says, I'm going to keep my blessing and my promise through you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to return you to this land. And Jacob, perhaps expecting an earful from God, receives grace. And I think that changed Jacob. I think a transformation happens within him. I think he gets up from that moment, from that experience from God, and I think he says, I need to start getting up and flying straight. I need to get my act together. I need to start living the way that I should. In fact, we hear his words. We hear and see this at the end of the 28th chapter. Right after this vision, we hear Jacob say, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I may again go to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. Jacob says, I'm going to start serving you as God. And I think for a time a change happened in Jacob. We kind of see it in the rest of the story. I don't know how many of you read through some of this. But next, Jacob is heading toward his uncle. And he comes across some shepherds. And what happens? He sees Rachel and he falls in love. Right? He is taken. And we know Jacob. We know that Jacob will do whatever he can to get what he wants. Right? He's a driven individual. He is going to do what it takes, even if he has to trick people. But now things are different. He wants to give up those trickery ways. He wants to do things right, and he's willing to do what it takes to have Rachel. So he meets up with Laban and his uncle, and they hit it off pretty well. And Laban says, you know what, just because you're my kid doesn't mean that you should work for me for nothing. So why don't you tell me your price? What will your wages be? And Jacob says, I will work 7 years for you, for your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban says, okay. And he works. 7 years, that's a pretty hefty price, right? I think Jacob goes beyond. He wants to make sure that he's doing this right, that he's earning his way. And they sing just a few moments because he loves her. And so Jacob has gotten up from this moment when he has experienced God. There's a change, I think, that takes place in him. He gets this sense that he needs to stand up, to fly straight, to put away his old trickery ways. And he goes, and he tries to make an honest man and an honest living and to do what's right. And everything seems to be going well. He's doing what he should. God is blessing everyone because of Jacob. Everything is going right. And then he wakes up and it's Leah instead of Rachel. The trickster has been tricked. Why does this happen to Jacob after he has changed his ways? Is this really about what goes around and comes around? You get what you deserve? Or does this say something to us about the promise of God? Do we begin to see a little bit more what the promise is and what the promise is not? Promise is that God is going to bless Jacob, and he is going to be a blessing to the world, and nothing is going to change that. But the promise is not that bad things won't ever happen to him, that he won't be taken advantage of by other people, that everything is just going to work out perfectly and safely for him. That's not the promise. The promise is that God is going to be with him and see him through. But not that everything is going to go perfectly right. Jacob tends to think that maybe this is a deal that he can strike, that if he does everything right, then everything will be received right. But that's not how God is working. The promise that God makes isn't contingent contingent on what Jacob does and how he acts, God's going to keep that promise because he made the promise with Abraham. And even though Jacob has said, yeah, if God does these things and I'm going to serve God, it doesn't mean that everything is going to be easy. Sometimes we can have an experience with God. And sometimes we can change completely who we are. But that doesn't mean that bad things won't happen to us. That's not the promise. The promise is that God will be with us and see us through it. I remember a time when I had gone to a new place and I was returning back to the place where I'd been from. I moved to Taylorsville. The first full-time ministry position I had was in Taylorsville. And Kara and I moved from Richmond, where I was in seminary, to Taylorsville. And I hadn't finished all of my seminary work. I'd done most of it, but there was one more class, and every once in a while I had to go back to finish up that classwork. And we had moved to Taylorsville, and a couple of weeks later, we had our first child. And so here we were in a new land, a new place. We didn't know a whole lot of people. And we had new jobs, a new life, new home. We didn't know our way around. And it was stressful. All this change and transition. And so one of those times when I was supposed to go back to Richmond, I decided I was going to go by myself. And Kara wanted to go with me. But I was determined to go by myself. I felt I needed the time away. I needed just to be alone. And so I made the decision that I was going without her. And we kind of got into a fight about it. And I just left. And I left her all alone. In a new place. A new child. By herself. And going down the road, I felt terrible about it. I felt so selfish, so greedy for myself, and I just fell apart. And I prayed. I said, God, this is a terrible thing that I've done. I've got to get some things right. And I felt God's presence. Can't really explain it. I just felt a peace. I felt on that busy highway that I was all by myself. And there was this peace. And I pulled over on the side of the road. And I felt peace. I said, God, I'm sorry. I'm going to change some things. I'm going to try to not be so selfish. Not just think about myself, but think about others. I made that promise to change. I got back on the highway. I let everyone cut in front of me. I didn't get mad at anybody. Go ahead. Yeah, I was, new life, right? New leaf. It was incredible. I felt so good. I've told you that story before. You might not have remembered that. That's okay, but I've told you that. But I don't think I've told you what happened at the end of that trip. At the end of that trip, I got into Richmond and it was night. And I wanted to talk to Kara. I had planned to stay with some friends, but I didn't want to talk to her, to make up and apologize to her while they were there. So I pulled into an empty parking lot. It was a preschool. They were not there at night. I pulled in and I got on my phone and I called and I apologized. I told felt like everything was going to be okay. And then all of a sudden, there were blue lights flashing behind me. And a police officer came up to my window. He said, "I need you to get out of the car." Apparently, a young guy in a pickup truck with out-of-state tags talking on a cell phone in a dark parking lot looked awful suspicious. And he really thought that I was either delivering drugs or making a call to receive some. And he searched my whole vehicle, got me out and searched me too. And it was one of the most embarrassing things that I had ever experienced. I understand it could have been a lot worse. Things could have been really bad. Of course, he didn't find anything. But to stand there, cars going by on both roads, and there I am being searched by the police. It was embarrassing. One of the most embarrassing moments of my life. And that happened right after that great and good experience. I made a promise that I was going to set things right. Why couldn't God spare me the humiliation of being searched by the police? Because it didn't work that way. The promise isn't that terrible things aren't going to happen to us, and that humiliating things aren't going to happen to us, or that we're not going to be taken advantage by other people. The promise is that God is going to be with us through it all. The promise is that no matter what happens, God is going to work. God is going to continue to do God's work. God didn't cause these things to happen. God didn't tell Laban to trick Jacob to teach him a lesson. God didn't do any of that, but God was present to work through it. The messiness of this story, and God says, it's not too messy for me, that I can still keep my promises through it. And it's not what God intended, but the blessing still comes. God works through this. And through this, Jacob has 12 sons. Become the 12 tribes of Israel. Become the blessing, the birthplace, the cradle of Christ. The promise isn't that terrible things will no longer happen. In fact, it continues on for Jacob. Remember? His own sons lied to him about the fate of his beloved son. He thinks that he's been killed. You remember that? He's tricked again. Promise isn't that bad things won't happen, that people won't trick you. The promise is that God is present. That God keeps His promise. That God will bless and work even through our messiness. And I know our lives are messy at times. Sometimes our lives look more like this. We get taken advantage of, even my family. It's a mess sometimes. But God works with it, through it. God always keeps God's promises. Thanks be to God.